I was standing in the doorway of my own boardroom, watching two women in navy blazers measure the wall where my wife's photograph had hung for 11 years, when I understood, with total clarity, that grief makes you slow, and slow men get buried. Eleanor had been in the ground for 6 days. The tape measure clicked shut in the taller woman's hand, and she said something to my daughter-in-law about load-bearing brackets. And Vanessa nodded like she was approving a paint color, instead of erasing my wife's face from the company we built, with a single 15-year-old delivery truck and $400 in a coffee can. I did not say a word. I have learned, in 40 years of freight contracts and union negotiations and boardroom knife fights, that the man who speaks first in a room like that has already lost something he can't get back. 3 days before that, the scent of funeral lilies was still thick in my kitchen, when Vanessa let herself in without knocking, dropped a manila folder on the granite counter Eleanor had picked out herself, and told me it was time to let the next generation lead. The folder was titled, in bold black letters, Emergency Transition and Continuity Agreement. Inside it was a request that I hand full operational control of Callahan Freight, a $15 million logistics company Eleanor and I had nursed through 3 recessions, 2 strikes, and 1 attempted hostile buyout in 1997, to my 17-year-old grandson, Tyler, held in trust, managed in practice by Vanessa and my son, Nathan. "You're 63, Robert," she'd said, in the voice she uses when she wants something to sound like kindness. "You just lost Eleanor. Nobody expects you to keep carrying all of this." I looked at that folder for a long time before I said anything. Then I said the only thing that was true. The company is running fine. I'm grieving. I'm not incapable. Nathan stood behind her in the kitchen doorway wearing a suit I'd bought him, looking at his shoes the way he'd looked at his shoes since he was 9 years old, and had done something he was ashamed of. He is 42. He has never once, in 42 years, looked me in the eye while lying to me. He looks at his shoes instead. I used to think that meant he had a conscience. I have since learned it just means he knows exactly what he's doing. "Dad, please," he said. "Your blood pressure's been through the roof. We're worried. Just let Tyler, hold the title in the trust, and Vanessa and I will handle daily operations. You can finally rest." I told them I'd think about it. I needed time to read the clauses. Nathan looked relieved, the way a man looks relieved when he expected a fight and got a delay instead. They walked out together, and through the reflection in my bay window. Eleanor always said that window was better than any mirror in the house. I watched Vanessa pause in the front hall, pull out her phone and type something fast with her thumbs. Before she pocketed it, she muttered 4 words under her breath, not knowing the glass was carrying her voice straight back to me. "He's buying it. Prep the transfer." I stood at my sink with the water still running over my hands, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the way it used to feel 40 years ago, sitting across a table from a shipping cartel that wanted to run me out of Denver, before I'd turned 30. A wolf that's lost his mate doesn't lose his teeth. He just goes quiet for a while. The next morning I was at the Callahan Freight Building by 6, before the sun had fully cleared the Rockies, needing the smell of diesel and cold coffee and the low hum of the dispatch floor to remind me who I was underneath the grief. I badged into the executive elevator, rode up to the top floor, and walked to the executive archive room at the end of the hall. The room that held backup copies of every trust document, every founding charter, every piece of paper that made Callahan Freight legally mine and Eleanor's before it was anyone else's. My master keycard had never failed in 11 years. I swiped it, red light. I swiped it again, red light. A voice behind me, far too pleased with itself for 6 in the morning, said, "Having trouble, Robert?" Marcus Reyes had been our chief financial officer for 6 years. He smelled like too much cologne, and he smiled like a man who'd already spent money he hadn't earned yet. He told me there was a security migration happening over the weekend, that Nathan had ordered it personally to protect sensitive data while I took some time to grieve. He said it with a straight face, standing 4 feet from me in a hallway I'd walked 10,000 times, and I understood in that moment that Nathan had not simply been talked into signing away my company. He was actively helping to lock his own father out of it, I did not grab him by his silk tie, though every muscle in my 63-year-old body wanted to. I nodded, told him I appreciated the diligence, and walked to my private office. Instead, I locked the door. I sat down at my desk, Eleanor's desk too, in every way that mattered, and I pressed my thumb to a biometric panel hidden beneath the bottom drawer. A compartment slid open. Inside was a hard drive I hadn't touched in a decade. 10 years ago, when a rival freight conglomerate tried to poach half our client list by bribing someone on the inside, I paid a very expensive, very quiet programmer to build an invisible backdoor into our servers. Nobody knew about it. Not Eleanor. Not Nathan. Not the board. It was insurance against a day I hoped would never come. That day had come. I connected the drive, typed the encryption sequence from memory, and watched the screen flicker to life. My finger hovered over the enter key. I was one keystroke from seeing exactly what Marcus Reyes and Vanessa had been doing behind that new security wall. My private cell phone rang. Almost nobody has that number. Nobody calls it at 6:20 in the morning with good news. The caller ID read Denver Memorial Hospital. I shut the laptop, shoved the drive back into its compartment, and I was in my truck before the second ring had finished, my hands not entirely steady on the wheel. The woman on the phone told me my grandson Tyler had been in a motorcycle accident on I-25, that he was in the trauma unit, that they needed family there immediately. I do not remember most of the drive. I remember running every yellow light between my office and the hospital and thinking, absurdly, that Eleanor would have scolded me for it. I found Nathan and Vanessa in the trauma ward waiting area. Nathan was pale and sweating, his tie loosened, his hands shaking. Vanessa was pacing in her heels, typing furiously on her phone, looking more inconvenienced than afraid. A tired-looking trauma surgeon came out in scrubs, stained with someone else's blood, and told us Tyler was stable but had lost a dangerous amount of blood from a deep laceration in his leg, and that the hospital's blood bank was critically low after a multi-vehicle pileup that same week had drained their reserves of his type. He's AB positive, the doctor said. We need direct family donors. We can cross-match you both right now. The words landed in my chest like a dropped anvil. Eleanor was O positive. I am O negative. By the plainest, most unforgiving law of basic genetics. The kind of thing you learn in a 10th grade biology class and never think about again until it detonates your entire life in a hospital corridor. Two O-type parents cannot produce an AB child. Not once. Not ever. It is not a matter of probability. It is a matter of biological impossibility, which meant Nathan, our biological son, could not be Tyler's biological father, unless the science that built and destroyed empires for 100 years was suddenly, conveniently wrong. I looked at Nathan. I expected confusion. I expected him to ask the doctor to double-check the chart, the way any father would if you told him his blood type didn't match his son's. Instead, Nathan went the color of drywall. He gripped the handrail on the wall so hard his knuckles went white, and he would not look at me, would not look at Vanessa, would not look at anyone. He stared at the floor like it might open up and swallow him, which, in a way that mattered far more than he understood yet, it already had. Vanessa, for her part, launched into a furious tirade at the doctor about flying in blood from a private facility, waving a platinum card like it could bend biology to her will. It worked, in its way. Money moved faster than truth. And within the hour, a transport helicopter was inbound with the supply Tyler needed. But I watched her do it, watched her spend $20,000 to avoid a simple blood draw of her own, and I understood that she, too, already knew exactly what that draw would reveal. I did not confront either of them in that hallway. You do not corner a wounded animal in open ground. I learned that lesson from union negotiators decades before I learned it from family. Instead, I suggested to Nathan that we get coffee from the cafeteria while we waited. He hesitated, glanced at Vanessa for permission like a man checking in with his warden, and then followed me down to the basement, to a cafeteria that smelled like burnt coffee and bleach. I let him sit across from me with his styrofoam cup for a full minute before I asked, as gently and as plainly as I could manage, how a boy born to an O-type father and an A-type mother could possibly carry an AB-positive blood type. He came apart, not into confession, into rage. He accused me of being confused by grief. of turning a lab clerical error into a conspiracy, of interrogating him while his son bled upstairs. He slammed his cup down hard enough to spill coffee across the table. It was, I have come to understand since, the exact behavior of a man defending a lie so old it has fused to his skeleton. A man with nothing to hide asks a doctor to recheck the chart. A man with everything to hide attacks the person asking the question. I did not press further. I told him he was probably right, that it was probably just a typo, and I watched something in his shoulders sag with temporary, false relief. Then I stood, buttoned my jacket, and told him I was going to check on the helicopter transport. I did not go back to the waiting room right away. I stood behind a concrete pillar near the nurse's station, and down the hall, half hidden by the glass, I watched Vanessa pace, with her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and vicious. "It is not a lab error," she was hissing. "Chase is not a Callahan by blood. I need proof, and I know exactly how to get it." The helicopter arrived. Tyler stabilized. By late afternoon, he was discharged with crutches and a stern warning about motorcycles, and I played the part of the relieved, grieving grandfather with a precision that would have made Eleanor proud and ashamed of me in equal measure. I hugged Nathan. I told Vanessa I'd check on them later. Then I drove home, and I began the quiet surgical work of finding out exactly how deep this lie had been buried, and exactly who had helped bury it. I bought 2 containers of soup and transferred them into my own dishware to make the visit look like an old man's kindness instead of an old man's reconnaissance. I tucked a pair of latex gloves and 2 sealed plastic bags into my coat pocket. I drove to the house I had bought for Nathan and Vanessa 3 years ago. The down payment, like nearly everything else in their life, had come from me, and I let myself be a tired, harmless grandfather bringing dinner. While Nathan warmed the soup, I excused myself to wash my hands, and instead I climbed the stairs to Tyler's room. He was asleep, headphones on, leg propped on pillows. In his bathroom I found his electric toothbrush, still faintly damp, and sealed it into the first bag without touching the bristlehead. On my way back down I detoured through the mudroom, where Nathan, a man of rigid, lazy habit, always dropped his gym bag in the same wicker hamper. In the collar of his gray athletic jacket, I found 2 dark hairs with intact roots, and I sealed them into the second bag. I stayed another 10 minutes, played my role, and left with the quiet destruction of their entire constructed life tucked into my coat pocket. I did not drive home. I drove 2 hours to a private genetics laboratory I'd found through an old contact from my freight security days, paid $5,000 in cash for an expedited, anonymous analysis, and was told to expect results within 48 hours. I was walking back to my truck in the parking lot when my phone buzzed with an alert I hadn't seen in 10 years. The silent tripwire from the back door I'd built into our servers. Someone was attempting to authorize a wire transfer of $4.5 million using a forged version of my own digital signature. The war, I understood then, had already started. I had simply been the last one to find out. I did not drive to the office. Confronting whoever sat at that terminal would only give them time to scrub the evidence before I could secure it. Instead, I drove home, locked myself in the study. Eleanor used to call my war room when I brought work home during the union strikes of the 90s and logged into the invisible back door for the first time in a decade. Green code cascaded down the screen. I watched, in real time, as Marcus Reyes tried to force an encrypted transfer through the system using a spoofed authorization package. His understanding of surface-level security was excellent. His understanding of the deep architecture I'd buried beneath it was non-existent. I froze the transfer in a quarantine he couldn't see or cancel, and then, instead of stopping, I kept digging. What I found over the next several hours made the cold thing in my chest turn into something closer to fury. 4 shell companies, all registered in Delaware under forgettable names: Meridian Freight Consulting, Highline Logistics Partners, and 2 others, each one issuing fabricated invoices for consulting work and software upgrades that never happened. The fake payments were small enough, individually, to slide beneath automatic board review, but stacked together over 8 months, they totaled $4.5 million. I traced the source of the money. It wasn't coming from operating revenue. It wasn't coming from the expansion fund. It was coming from the employee pension, truck drivers, warehouse managers, dispatch coordinators who had given 20 and 30 years of their lives to this company. Their retirement, quietly, systematically drained. And when I lined up the dates of the largest transfers against my own memory, my stomach turned over completely. The first withdrawal had happened 8 months earlier, the same week Eleanor received her diagnosis. While I sat in oncology waiting rooms holding my wife's hand as she prepared to die, Marcus Reyes and Vanessa had been robbing the people who built this company alongside us. They had used her illness as cover. They had used my grief as a distraction. Every visit Vanessa made to the hospice, I now understood, had likely come with a mental tally of how much more she could move before anyone noticed. I pulled the emergency transition and continuity agreement out of my briefcase and, for the first time, read past the sympathetic opening pages to the clauses buried near the back. There it was. A full indemnification for the incoming leadership against any prior financial discrepancies, and a mandatory authorization, under my own signature, for the year-end audit. The document was never about handing Tyler a company. It was a legal shield, engineered to place my signature on top of a $4.5 million hole, 3 weeks before an independent audit was scheduled to find it. They didn't just want to steal the company. They wanted to frame me for the theft on their way out the door. I sat in that study until nearly dawn, the photograph of Eleanor on my desk, watching me, the way it had watched me make every hard decision of the last 30 years. I thought about the wolf again, the old, tired image that kept surfacing in my mind since the funeral. A lone wolf loses his mate. He does not, for one single day, lose his teeth. I picked up my phone and called Walter Bishop, my attorney of 25 years, a man who had spent his career taking apart companies far larger than mine with nothing but patience and a very sharp pen. "Walter," I said, and my voice had already stopped shaking. "Clear your week. We have fraud, we have a forged signature, and we have a violation of Eleanor's bloodline clause. I need everything documented, and I need it done quietly." There was a pause on the line, and then, in the flat, focused voice of a man who has just realized the fight he's about to be part of is going to be memorable, he asked, "Who are the targets?" I looked at the photograph of my wife. "My son," I said, "my daughter-in-law, and our CFO. What I did not yet know, what would take 3 more days, a private investigator named Sam Delgado, and one deleted email pulled from a server nobody thought to fully erase, was exactly how long this betrayal had been running, and exactly how much further back the lie went than a single dishonest year. That discovery was still ahead of me, and it would be worse, far worse, than anything I had uncovered so far. The next 3 days I moved through my own life like a man performing a role written by someone else. I went to the office. I nodded at Marcus Reyes in the hallway with the same polite smile I'd given him for 6 years. I answered Nathan's increasingly anxious calls about the transition agreement with a tired, defeated voice, telling him I needed a little more time to get my affairs in order. Every word was a calculated performance. I was a man standing in the center of a burning building, calmly straightening his tie while quietly bolting every door from the inside. I spent those same 3 days barely sleeping, drinking black coffee at my desk at home, waiting for Sam Delgado to call. Sam was a retired federal investigator I'd used twice before, decades ago, back when a rival carrier tried to poach half our routes through bribery. He was efficient, discreet, and entirely without sentiment when properly paid. I met him on the evening of the 3rd day, at a 24-hour diner on the industrial edge of Denver. The kind of place that smelled like old fryer oil and better coffee than it had any right to serve. He slid a thick folder across the table before I'd even finished sitting down. "You were right to start with Reyes," he said, his voice low and even. "They weren't as careful as they thought. Arrogance rarely is." The first page was a photograph, time-stamped 3 weeks earlier, of Vanessa and Marcus at a quiet restaurant an hour outside the city, sitting far closer than colleagues sit, his hand resting over hers on the tablecloth. It wasn't a business dinner. It was the unmistakable body language of 2 people with a long, private history. "They didn't meet during the merger 5 years ago the way they've always told people," Sam said, tapping a stack of transcripts near the back of the folder. I pulled records from Colorado State, They met there 20 years ago, lived together off campus for 2 years before she transferred out. When neither of them had family money to build the life they wanted, they went looking for a faster way to get it. I turned the pages slowly. Hotel receipts, flight manifests, a pattern of contact stretching back 2 full decades, maintained quietly through Vanessa's entire marriage to my son. And Tyler? I asked. Though some part of me already knew the shape of the answer, Sam nodded once. I got a discrete sample from Reyes yesterday morning. Ran it against what you gave me from the boy. Marcus Reyes is Tyler's biological father. Vanessa was already pregnant with his child before she ever married Nathan. It landed exactly the way I expected it to, and somehow still worse. A 20-year con, patient and cold. Vanessa had used my weak-willed son to gain a foothold inside the Callahan family, and she'd used a child conceived with another man to plant a permanent biological claim on everything Eleanor and I had built. She hadn't married into this family. She had infiltrated it. The way a company infiltrates a market it intends to hollow out from the inside. But the true blow, the one that would strip the last of my son away from me, was still folded inside that dossier. Sam pulled out a single printed sheet, clipped separately from the rest. This took some unconventional digging, he said. Derated server archive. I thought you needed to see the whole picture before Friday. It was an email, dated 10 years earlier, sent from a private account belonging to Nathan directly to Vanessa. I read it once, and then I read it again because my mind refused to accept it the first time. Vanessa got the specialist's results today. Confirmed. I'm sterile. Permanent, from the infection when I was a kid. There's no chance I can ever father a child. We have to be careful. If Dad finds out I can't give the family a biological heir, he'll enforce Mom's bloodline clause and cut me out completely. Leave it all to Charity. We keep the story. He can never know. Chase is the only thing keeping my inheritance safe. The diner noise disappeared. The hum of the refrigerator, the low murmur of the other tables. All of it fell away into a ringing silence. Nathan had known. Not suspected, known, with a signed medical letter in hand for 10 full years. He had known that Tyler was not his son, known that Vanessa had brought another man's child into our family, and instead of coming to me with the truth, he had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, for a decade, to become an active partner in the deception. Because Eleanor, fiercely protective of the legacy we'd built from nothing, had insisted on an ironclad clause in our family trust. The bulk of our estate would only ever pass to a direct biological Callahan. Nathan knew that clause would strip him of everything the moment his infertility became known, so he had traded his mother's honor, and mine, for a paycheck disguised as fatherhood. He was not a victim in this. He was a co-architect. I folded the email and slid it back into the dossier, and I sat there for a long moment feeling something in me finish breaking, and then quietly begin to reassemble into something harder. I thanked Sam for his work. I asked him one final question, whether he could confirm, discreetly, if there was anyone else on the payroll helping Reyes move the pension money. He told me he'd already flagged 2 junior accountants who looked more like frightened bystanders than co-conspirators, and I filed that away, because not every casualty in this war needed to be a casualty. I drove home with the dossier on the passenger seat and did not go to bed. Instead, I opened the small cedar box that had sat on my dresser since the week of Eleanor's funeral. The one thing of hers I had not been able to bring myself to open until that night. Inside was the silver pocket watch her father had given her the day she and I signed the papers on our very first delivery truck, and beneath it, a handful of coins she'd kept from the exact fare of our first paid freight run in 1985, the one that had put $51 in a coffee can and convinced 2 exhausted 20-somethings that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake. I held the watch in my palm for a long time. Then I put it in my breast pocket, where it stayed until Friday. The next 2 days, Vanessa and Marcus, believing they had already neutralized me, stopped being careful. Their arrogance became a kind of drug. Without waiting for a single signature, they began purging the company of anyone who might ask questions. My VP of Operations, Frank Doyle, a man who'd been with me since before Nathan was born, who used to sneak Nathan candy from his desk drawer when he was a boy waiting for me to finish late meetings, was handed a severance package and a security escort out of the building on Wednesday afternoon. Our HR director and our logistics coordinator followed by Thursday morning, replaced by 3 new hires Marcus had handpicked, compliant enough to sign whatever was put in front of them. Frank called me from the parking lot, furious and confused, asking what the hell was happening to the company we'd built together. I told him to take the severance quietly, not to cause a scene, and to take a short, well-earned vacation. I told him, in a voice that left no room for doubt, that he'd be back in his chair by Monday. He trusted me the way loyal men trust the people who've earned it. He didn't ask a single follow-up question. I spent Thursday walking the halls of my own company like a ghost, playing the departing, defeated founder for anyone watching. Around noon, I wandered into my own corner office and found 2 interior designers with measuring tape, and Vanessa standing in the middle of the room, pointing at the dark walnut paneling and demanding it be painted a stark, sterile white. She was already selecting fabric for furniture that hadn't arrived yet, erasing 30 years of history from a room she hadn't earned the right to stand in. She glanced at me in the doorway and offered a brief, patronizing smile, told me not to worry, that they'd box up my personal things for me that evening. I noticed, on the wall behind her, the founder's wall, the photograph of Eleanor and me standing beside our very first truck in 1985, exhausted and grinning, 2 people who'd just discovered that struggle could turn into something real. 2 workers were already unscrewing its frame from the wall to make room for whatever she intended to hang there instead. I said nothing. I thanked her for her consideration and walked away. But something in me sharpened at the sight of that empty bracket where Eleanor's face used to hang. It was one thing to steal a company. It was another thing entirely to erase the woman who built it. While Vanessa selected paint swatches, Walter Bishop and I were operating in a different current entirely. He'd reached a contact of his in the FBI's white-collar crime division, a veteran agent named Rachel Kim who had crossed paths with Walter in court more than once and respected him precisely because he never brought her weak evidence. We gave her federal team direct access to the digital backdoor I'd built a decade earlier. They spent 2 full days tracing the money through the 4 shell companies, verifying the forged signatures, mapping the offshore routing, and securing warrants to freeze the accounts on the other end. By Thursday evening, Agent Kim told Walter her teams would be positioned near the building by dawn Friday, ready to move the moment we gave the signal. Friday morning, I stood in my closet and did not reach for the dark, defeated suits I'd worn all week. I pulled out a charcoal bespoke suit I hadn't worn since I closed our largest contract a decade earlier, the armor I wear when I intend to dismantle something completely. I dressed slowly. I fastened the platinum cufflinks Eleanor had given me on our 20th anniversary. I tied a deep crimson tie in a perfect knot. In the mirror, the stooped, grieving widower from the last 6 days was gone. What looked back at me was the man who had built Callahan Freight out of a rusted truck and $400, who had survived 2 recessions, a union strike, and a hostile buyout attempt, and who had buried his wife 6 days ago and still had teeth left to bite with. I slipped Eleanor's silver pocket watch into my breast pocket, next to the sealed lab report and the printed email. I checked the time. The board meeting was set for 9. The federal agents were already moving into position. Walter had the disinheritance and termination paperwork finalized in his briefcase. I drove to headquarters knowing exactly what I intended to let happen and exactly what I intended to do once it did. The mahogany doors of the boardroom were closed when I arrived. I didn't knock. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The room was full. Vanessa had assembled an audience for her moment of triumph. She sat in my chair at the head of the table. Nathan sat pale and sweating to her right. Marcus Reyes sat to her left, wearing the same smug, victorious expression he'd worn in the hallway 3 days earlier. Tyler sat further down, scrolling on his phone, oblivious to the storm about to break directly over his head. The rest of the table was filled with the new hires Marcus had installed that week, already looking uneasy in chairs they hadn't earned. I walked the length of the table to the only empty seat, at the far end, facing all of them. The room went silent except for the low tick of the antique clock in the corner. A clock Eleanor had bought at an estate sale the year we opened our second warehouse. Vanessa slid a thick folder down the table toward me, a heavy gold pen resting on top. "This is the final agreement," she said, her voice sharp, all pretense of sympathy gone. "The board has approved the transition. All we need is your signature." I looked at the folder. Buried inside it was the indemnification clause that would put my name on top of a $4.5 million theft. I looked back up at her. She leaned back in my chair, and the mask came off completely. "Now that the old woman's gone," she said with a small, cruel smile, "you'll put the company in my son's name and step aside. You're done here, Robert. It's our turn." The room went very still. Even the new hires, loyal as they'd been hired to be, seemed to flinch at the naked cruelty of it. I did not react to the insult against Eleanor. I picked up the gold pen, turned it slowly in my fingers, and looked at Nathan. I gave him one last, silent chance, a look that asked him to be a man, to stop this before the ground opened beneath all of them. For one brief second, something like hesitation crossed his face. Then he looked away, down at his shoes, the way he always had. I set the pen down on the table. It made a small, sharp sound against the wood. "No," I said. The double doors of the boardroom swung open. Walter Bishop walked in, flanked by 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers, and the temperature of the room dropped to something close to freezing. Walter didn't pause for pleasantries. He crossed the room with the flat, deliberate stride of a man who has done this before and takes no pleasure in it, stopped in front of Vanessa and set a sealed envelope on the table between her and Nathan. "I represent Robert Callahan in all matters concerning the Eleanor Callahan Family Trust and the leadership of Callahan Freight," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This document is a certified, independently verified paternity analysis, completed 48 hours ago. The result is a 0% probability that Nathan Callahan is the biological father of Tyler Callahan." A horrified gasp broke from somewhere down the table. Tyler's phone slipped from his hand and hit the wood with a small, final clatter. He turned to his mother, his face draining of color, silently begging her to say it wasn't true. Vanessa didn't look at him. Her composure cracked in an instant, the practiced arrogance collapsing into raw animal panic. Beside her, Marcus went rigid, understanding exactly what the presence of federal agents in dark windbreakers meant for a man who'd spent 8 months quietly bleeding a pension fund. He half rose from his chair. One of the agents put a firm hand on his shoulder and put him right back down. "Under the terms of the Callahan Trust," Walter continued, "corporate and financial succession is bound exclusively to verified biological heirs. There is no exception. Because this succession agreement rests on a fraudulent representation of parentage, it is void, effective immediately. You hold no claim to this company. None." Nathan shot to his feet, pointing a shaking finger at his wife, already performing the outrage of a betrayed man. I let him get 3 sentences into it before I reached into my briefcase and threw the printed email onto the table in front of him. He didn't need to read it. He recognized his own words from across the room, and I watched 10 years of careful lying die on his face in real time. He didn't deny it. He sat back down and put his head in his hands. Vanessa and Marcus turned on each other next, each one screaming that the other had promised the tracks were covered, that the timeline was the other's fault, that greed belonged to someone else. It was, I noted with no satisfaction at all, exactly the sound 2 people make when the only thing that ever held them together was what they could steal. Aja Kim's team read them their rights and walked them out in handcuffs. Marcus went in silence. His shoulders already collapsed under the weight of what was coming. Vanessa did not go quietly. She screamed that she'd given this family 20 years, that she deserved a share of everything, that I owed her. I watched her dragged out with something closer to sorrow than triumph, because underneath the venom in that dossier there had also been a girl who grew up in 5 different foster homes before she turned 16, who had spent 2 decades terrified of ever being poor again, and had let that fear curdle into something that destroyed her. It didn't excuse what she'd done to Eleanor's pension fund, to Eleanor's memory, to a 17-year-old boy who'd done nothing but exist inside a lie he never chose. But it made the whole thing sadder than victorious, and I let myself feel that once, before I put it away. I walked to Nathan's chair and dropped a single sheet of paper into his lap, an eviction notice for the house I'd bought him, and a termination of his employment. He looked up at me, eyes wet, and asked where he was supposed to go. You sold your mother's honor and mine 10 years ago to protect an inheritance you'd already lied your way into, I told him. You are disinherited. You are terminated. Don't contact me again. Then I turned to Tyler, who sat frozen, 17 years old, and watching his entire identity dissolve in front of him. I kept my voice steadier for him than I had for anyone else in that room. None of this is your doing, I said. You didn't choose the family you were born into. You're not a Callahan by blood, and that means you're not entitled to what this company built. But I'll cover your tuition and your living costs for 1 year. That gives you time to find your footing. After that, you're on your own. He nodded, a single tear sliding down his face, and thanked me, and walked out with more dignity than either of his parents had managed all morning. 6 months passed. Vanessa and Marcus were sentenced to 15 years each for wire fraud and embezzlement of pension funds. Vanessa stood in the courtroom in a state uniform with none of the fire she'd shown in my boardroom. Nathan, cut off completely, ended up in a small apartment on the east side of Denver, stocking shelves at a hardware store for minimum wage. The first honest work, I'm told, he's ever done in his life. I felt no pity watching that report. He was harvesting exactly what he'd planted. I brought Frank Doyle back within the week, along with everyone Marcus had pushed out. Working with Agent Kim's team, we traced every dollar through the shell companies and recovered the full $4.5 million, and I personally oversaw its return to the pension accounts. Every driver, every warehouse manager, every dispatcher made whole. I stood in front of the whole company the morning that was finished and told them the storm had passed. I meant it. The founder's wall went back up that same week. Eleanor's photograph rehung in its original bracket by my own hands. No interior designer required. On a clear Tuesday morning, I rode up to the roof with Walter and signed a new trust. Half of everything Eleanor and I built went into a scholarship fund bearing her name for kids with nothing but ambition and no way to pay for it. The other half went into an employee ownership program, the drivers, the dispatchers, the people who actually built this company alongside us, finally holding a real piece of what they'd carried on their backs for decades. Before I left the office that evening, I opened the cedar box on my desk, took out Eleanor's silver pocket watch, and set it on the shelf beneath our photograph on the founder's wall, where it stays today. Family was never about blood in this house. It was about who stayed, and who told the truth, and who was willing to carry the weight when it mattered. A lone wolf loses his mate, he doesn't lose his teeth, and I still have mine.